Hello, this is John Rhapsodes, purveyor of awesome old-school audio stories, bringing you a story today called The Notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County by Mark Twain, published in 1865 when Twain was 30 years old. Mark Twain, whose given name was Samuel Clemens, lived from 1835 to 1910, coming into the world and leaving it with Halley's Comet. Hear the words of old. The Notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County by Mark Twain. In compliance with the request of a friend of mine who wrote me from the East, I called on good-natured, garrulous old Simon Wheeler and inquired after my friend's friend, Leonidas W. Smiley, as requested to do, and I hereunto append the result. I have a lurking suspicion that Leonidas W. Smiley is a myth, that my friend never knew such a personage, and that he only conjectured that if I asked old Wheeler about him, it would remind him of his infamous Jim Smiley, and he would go to work and bore me to death with some exasperating reminiscence of him, as long and as tedious as it should be useless to me. If that was the design, it succeeded. I found Simon Wheeler dozing comfortably by the bar-room stove of the dilapidated tavern in the decaying mining camp of Angels, and I noticed that he was fat and bald-headed and had an expression of winning gentleness and simplicity upon his tranquil countenance. He roused up and gave me a good day. I told him a friend of mine had commissioned me to make some inquiries about a cherished companion of his boyhood named Leonidas W. Smiley, Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, a young minister of the gospel, who he had heard was at one time a resident of Angel's Camp. I added that if Mr. Wheeler could tell me anything about this Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, I would feel under many obligations to him. Simon Wheeler backed me into a corner and blockaded me there with his chair, and then sat down and reeled off the monotonous narrative which follows this paragraph. He never smiled, he never frowned, he never changed his voice from the gentle flowing key to which he tuned his initial sentence. He never betrayed the slightest suspicion of enthusiasm. But all through the interminable narrative, there ran a vein of impressive earnestness and sincerity, which showed me plainly that, so far from his imagining that there was anything ridiculous or funny about his story, he regarded it as a really important matter, and admired its two heroes as men of transcendent genius in finesse. I let him go on in his own way, and never interrupted him once. And hereunto follows Simon Wheeler's story. Reverend Leonidas W. Well, there was a feller here once by the name of Jim Smiley in the winter of '49, or maybe it was the spring of '50. I don't recollect exactly, somehow, though what makes me think it was one or the other is because I remember the big flume warn't finished when he first come to the camp. But anyway, he was the curiousest man about always betting on anything that turned up you ever saw, if he could get anybody to bet on the other side, and if he couldn't, he'd change sides. Anyway, what suited the other man would suit him. As long as he got a bet, he was satisfied. But still, he was lucky, uncommon lucky. He most always come out winner. He was always ready and laying for a chance. There couldn't be no solitary thing mentioned but that feller'd offer to bet on it, and take airy side you please, as I was just telling you. If there was a horse race, you'd find him flush, or you'd find him busted at the end of it. If there was a dog fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a cat fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a chicken fight, he'd bet on it. Why, if there was two birds setting on a fence, he would bet you which one would fly first. Or, if there was a camp meeting, he would be there regular to bet on Parson Walker, who he judged to be the best exhorter around here, and so he was too, and a good man. If Jim Smiley even saw a straddlebug start to go anywheres, he would bet you how long it would take him to get to wherever he was going to, and if you took him up, he would follow that straddlebug to Mexico so he could find out where it was bound for and how long it was on the road. Lots of the boys here has seen that Jim Smiley and can tell you all about him. Why, it never made no difference to him. He'd bet on anything, the dangdest feller. Parson Walker's wife laid sick once, for a good while too, and it seemed as if they weren't gonna save her. But one morning Parson Walker come in, and Smiley up and asked him how she was, and he said she was considerable better, thank the Lord for his infinite mercy, and coming on so smart that with the blessing of Providence she'd get well yet. And Smiley, before he thought better of it, says, "Well, I'll risk $2.50 she don't, anyway." This here Smiley had a mare. The boys call her the 15-minute nag, but that was only in fun, you know, because, of course, she was faster than that. And he used to win money on that horse, even though she was so slow and always had the asthma or the distemper or the consumption or something of that kind. They used to give her 200 or 300 yards start and then pass her underway. But always at the end of the race, she'd get excited and desperate like, and come cavorting and straddling up, and scattering her legs around limber, sometimes in the air and sometimes out to one side among the fences, and kicking up more dust and raising more racket with her coughing and sneezing and blowing her nose, and would always fetch up at the finish line just about a neck ahead, as near as you could cipher it down. And Smiley had a little small bull pup, that to look at him you'd think he warn't worth a cent, but to set around and look ornery and lay for a chance to steal something. But as soon as money was up on him, he was a different dog. His underjaw'd begin to stick out like the forecastle of a steamboat, and his teeth would uncover and shine like the furnaces. And a dog might tackle his dog and bullyrag him, and bite him, and throw him over his shoulder 2 or 3 times, and Andrew Jackson, which was the name of the pup, Andrew Jackson would never let on but that he was satisfied, and hadn't expected nothing else, and the bets being doubled and doubled on the other side all the time, till the money was all up. And then all of a sudden Andrew Jackson would grab that other dog just by the gent of his hind leg and freeze to it. Not chew, you understand, but only just grip and hang on till they throwed up the sponge, if it took a year. Smiley always come out winner on that pup, till he fought a dog once that didn't have no hind legs, because they'd been sawed off in a circular saw. And when the fight had gone along far enough, and the money was all up, and Andrew Jackson come to make a snatch for his favorite leg hold, he saw in a minute how he'd been imposed upon, and how the other dog had him in the door, so to speak, and he appeared surprised. And then he looked sort of discouraged like, and didn't try no more to win the fight. And so, he got shucked out bad. That dog gave Smiley a look, as much as to say his heart was broke, and it was his fault for putting up a dog that hadn't no hind legs for him to take hold of, which was his main dependence in a fight. And then he limped off a piece and laid down and died. It was a good pup, was that Andrew Jackson, and would have made a name for himself if he'd lived, for the stuff was in him, and he had genius. I know it, because he hadn't had no opportunities to speak of, and it don't stand to reason that a dog could make such a fight as he could under them circumstances if he hadn't no talent. It always makes me feel sorry when I think of that last fight of his'n, and the way it turned out. Well, this here Smiley had rat terriers and chicken cocks and tomcats and all them kind of things, till you couldn't rest, and you couldn't fetch nothing for him to bet on, but he'd match you. Smiley catched a frog one day and took him home, and said he calculated to educate him. And so he never done nothing for 3 months but set in his backyard and learn that frog to jump. And you bet he did learn him too. He'd give him a little punch behind, and the next minute you'd see that frog whirling in the air like a donut. See him turn one somerset or maybe a couple if he got a good start, and come down flat-footed and all right, like a cat. He got him up so in the matter of catching flies, and kept him in practice so constant, that frog would nail a fly every time as far as he could see him. Smiley said all a frog wanted was education, and he could do most anything. And I believe him. Why, I've seen him set Daniel Webster down here on this floor. Daniel Webster was the name of the frog, and sing out, "Flies, Daniel, flies!" And quicker'n you could wink, that frog would spring straight up and snake a fly off the counter there, and flop down on the floor again as solid as a gob of mud, and fall to scratching the side of his head with his hind foot, as indifferent as if he hadn't no idea he'd been doing any more'n a frog might do. You never see a frog so modest and straightforward as he was, even though he was so gifted. And when it come to fair and square jumping on a dead level, that frog could get over more ground at one straddle than any animal of his breed you ever saw. Jumping on a dead level was his strong suit, you understand. And when it come to that, Smiley would ante up money on him as long as he had a red. Smiley was monstrous proud of his frog, and well he might be, for fellers that had traveled and been everywheres all said he laid over any frog that they ever see. Well, Smiley kept the beast in a little lattice box, and he used to fetch him downtown sometimes and lay for a bet. One day a feller, a stranger in camp he was, come across him with his box and says, "What might it be that you've got in that box?" And Smiley says, sorta indifferent like, "It might be a parrot, or it might be a canary maybe, but it ain't. It's only just a frog." And the feller took it and looked at it careful and turned it round this way and that and says, "So it is. Well, what's he good for?" "Well," Smiley says, easy and careless, "he's good enough for one thing, I should judge. He can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." The feller took the box again and took another long, particular look and give it back to Smiley and says, very deliberate, "Well," he says, "I don't see no points about that frog that's any better'n any other frog. Maybe you don't, Smiley says. Maybe you understand frogs and maybe you don't understand them. Maybe you've had experience and maybe you ain't, only an amateur as it were. Anyways, I've got my opinion, and I'll risk $40 that he can outjump any frog in Calaveras County. And the feller studied a minute, and then says, kinda sad-like, well, I'm only a stranger here, and I ain't got no frog. But if I had a frog, I'd bet you. And then Smiley says, that's all right, that's all right. If you hold my box a minute, I'll go get you a frog. And so the feller took the box and put up his $40 along with Smiley's and sat down to wait. So the feller sat there a good while, thinking and thinking to himself, and then he got the frog out and pried his mouth open, and took a teaspoon and filled the frog full of quail shot, filled him pretty near up to his chin, and set him on the floor. Smiley, he went to the swamp and slopped around in the mud for a long time, and finally he catched a frog and fetched him in and give him to this feller and says, now, if you're ready, set him alongside of Daniel, with his forepaws just even with Daniel's, and I'll give the word. Then he says, 1, 2, 3, get! And him and the feller touched up the frogs from behind, and the new frog hopped off lively, but Daniel gave a heave, and histed up his shoulders like a Frenchman. But it weren't no use. Daniel couldn't budge. He was planted as solid as a church, and he couldn't no more stir than if he was anchored out. Smiley was a good deal surprised, and he was disgusted too, but he didn't have no idea what the matter was, of course. The feller took the money and started away, and when he was going out the door, he sorta jerked his thumb over his shoulder at Daniel and says again, very deliberate, well, he says, I don't see no points about that frog that's any better than any other frog. Smiley, he stood scratching his head and looking down at Daniel a long time, and at last he says, I do wonder what in the nation that frog throwed off for. I wonder if there ain't something the matter with him. He appears to look mighty baggy somehow. And he catched Daniel by the nape of the neck and hefted him and says, why, blame my cats if he don't weigh 5 pounds. And turned him upside down, and the frog belched out a double handful of shot. And then Smiley saw how it was, and he was the maddest man. He set the frog down and took out after that feller, but he never catched him, and here Simon Wheeler heard his name called from the front yard and got up to see what was wanted. And turning to me as he moved away, he said, just set where you are there, stranger, and rest easy. I ain't gonna be gone but a second. But, by your leave, I did not think that a continuation of the history of the enterprising vagabond Jim Smiley would be likely to afford me information concerning the Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, and so I started away. At the door, I met the sociable Wheeler returning, and he buttonholed me and recommenced. Well, this here Smiley had a yeller one-eyed cow that didn't have no tail, only just a short stump like a banana, and however, lacking both time and inclination, I did not wait to hear about the afflicted cow, but took my leave. And that concludes Mark Twain's 1865 story, The Notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. This is John Rhapsodies, purveyor of awesome old-school audio stories. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more, please help me earn the warm embrace of Mr. and Mrs. YouTubes, who look with loving favor upon those channels whose listeners faithfully subscribe, like, comment, click the notification bell, and share the videos with their friends so that they too can hear the words of old.